Ladies and gentlemen, today we look back on an era that shaped organized crime in America, an era where the streets were ruled by those who lived by a code of loyalty, power, and influence. From the roaring 20s to the mid-century upheavals, a man emerged who redefined what it meant to be a gangster. Not just through violence, but through strategy, diplomacy, and an iron grip on the underworld. The journey to dominance in the criminal underworld was not one of luck or chance. It was one of calculated moves, survival, and an unbreakable will to succeed. Born into a world of poverty, his early years were shaped by hardship and the unforgiving streets of New York City. Like many young immigrants of his time, he was thrust into a society where opportunities were limited, and the American dream seemed out of reach for those who lacked wealth or connections. From a young age, he recognized that power wasn't simply given, it had to be taken. The streets became his first education, a place where he learned the rules of survival, who to trust, when to fight, and when to walk away. He aligned himself with local gangs, engaging in petty crimes that served as an introduction to the violent and lucrative world of organized crime. It was in these early years that he developed a reputation, not just as a street tough, but as someone with intelligence and a talent for leadership. His first major step into the underworld came when he connected with other ambitious young men who would go on to become some of the most feared and respected figures in organized crime history. Recognizing his potential, they brought him into their operations, teaching him the inner workings of the illicit trades that fueled the city's underground economy. Bootlegging, extortion, and gambling were the foundation of their empire, and he quickly proved himself to be more than just another soldier. He was a strategist, a thinker, and most importantly, a man who understood how to play the long game. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not rely solely on violence to get ahead. He was a man who understood the value of diplomacy and networking. While others resorted to brute force, he built alliances, forged friendships, and learned how to manipulate the system to his advantage. He made the right connections, inside and outside of the criminal world, gaining favor with corrupt politicians, law enforcement officials, and powerful businessmen who could offer protection and opportunities that violence alone never could. During Prohibition, he saw the enormous potential of the illegal liquor trade. At a time when the nation's thirst for alcohol was insatiable, he positioned himself as a key player in the bootlegging business. Working alongside some of the most influential gangsters of the time, he helped orchestrate the smuggling and distribution of illegal liquor, turning what was once a small-time operation into a multi-million-dollar empire. But unlike others who flaunted their wealth and power, he maintained a low profile, preferring to operate behind the scenes. This ability to blend in, to appear more like a businessman than a gangster, would become one of his greatest strengths. As his wealth grew, so did his influence. He expanded his operations beyond bootlegging, investing in gambling, racketeering, and other lucrative enterprises. He understood that the key to long-term success was not just making money, but keeping it, and for that he needed protection. He deepened his ties with politicians and law enforcement, ensuring that he had people in power who would look the other way when necessary. By the time the 1930s arrived, he was no longer just another gangster. He was a power broker, a man whose influence extended beyond the streets and into the halls of government. He was respected by his peers and feared by his enemies, but what truly set him apart was his ability to navigate the fine line between crime and legitimacy. While others sought notoriety, he sought control. And in doing so, he set the stage for an era in which the Mafia would become more than just a collection of criminals. It would become a well-oiled machine, one that operated in the shadows yet held sway over some of the most powerful institutions in America. This was just the beginning. His rise to power was not just about wealth or reputation, it was about building something bigger than himself. And as the years went on, he would continue to cement his legacy, not through force, but through intellect, cunning, and an unmatched understanding of how power truly worked. The 1920s ushered in one of the most transformative periods in American history, a time of jazz, roaring nightlife, and economic prosperity. But beneath the surface of this cultural revolution, another force was at work. The passage of the Volstead Act in 1920, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcohol, created an opportunity that would change the face of organized crime forever. It was an era that turned street criminals into millionaires, and those who had the foresight to seize the moment became legends of the underworld. From the very start, he recognized the immense potential of Prohibition. While law-abiding citizens saw it as a crackdown on vice, he saw it as the perfect business opportunity. The demand for alcohol didn't disappear, it simply went underground. And he knew that those who could control the supply would wield immense power. But unlike many who rushed into the bootlegging trade with reckless ambition, he approached it with the precision of a businessman, carefully crafting an operation that was as efficient as it was lucrative. He wasn't just a smuggler, he was an architect of an empire. He built an extensive network that stretched from Canada to the Caribbean, ensuring a steady flow of illegal liquor into the United States. He forged partnerships with suppliers, bribed customs officials, and arranged for shipments to be safely transported through secret routes. His operation was not a crude, small-time racket. It was a sophisticated distribution system that rivaled legitimate businesses in its organization. But smuggling was only one part of the equation. Once the alcohol reached American soil, it had to be stored, distributed, and sold. He orchestrated an intricate supply chain, ensuring that speakeasies, private clubs, and underground bars were always stocked with high-quality liquor. He employed skilled drivers, corrupt police officers, and even business owners who helped keep the flow of alcohol uninterrupted. Every shipment, every transaction, and every dollar that changed hands was carefully managed, allowing him to maximize profits while minimizing risk. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not rely on brute force to dominate the liquor trade. Violence, while sometimes necessary, was not his preferred method of operation. He understood that longevity in business, legal or illegal, came from maintaining relationships rather than destroying them. Instead of waging bloody wars over territory, he often negotiated deals with rival bootleggers, establishing a network of cooperation rather than constant conflict. His ability to maintain peace in an industry known for its volatility allowed his empire to flourish, while others fell victim to internal feuds and government crackdowns. Of course, no business, especially one built on illegal foundations, could thrive without protection. He knew that keeping law enforcement and politicians on his side was just as important as running a smooth operation. He funneled money into political campaigns, bribed key officials, and developed relationships with high-ranking figures in government who ensured that his activities remained undisturbed. Judges, district attorneys, and even lawmakers found themselves in his pocket, turning a blind eye to his operations in exchange for generous payouts. This political influence became one of his greatest assets, shielding him from the same fate that befell many less connected gangsters of the time. The wealth generated from the bootlegging trade was staggering. The money poured in faster than it could be spent, and with it came the ability to expand beyond alcohol. He reinvested his profits into other ventures, gambling dens, loan sharking, labor racketeering, creating multiple streams of income that would sustain his empire long after Prohibition ended. But more than just money, this era cemented his reputation as a power player in the criminal world. By the late 1920s, he was no longer just a bootlegger, he was a kingpin, a businessman who had mastered the art of making crime look like commerce. He had built an empire that stretched across state lines, influencing industries far beyond alcohol. And while others fought for control with guns and bloodshed, he quietly built his power through strategy, influence, and an unmatched ability to adapt to the ever-changing landscape of organized crime. Yet, Prohibition was never meant to last forever. As the government began to reconsider the ban on alcohol, the winds of change started to blow. Some saw the repeal of Prohibition as the end of an era. But for him, it was simply another opportunity, one that would take him from the world of bootlegging into an even more lucrative empire of organized crime. Power in the underworld wasn't just about running illegal businesses or controlling the streets, it was about influence. And influence didn't come solely from the fear of violence. It came from knowing the right people, placing them in the right positions, and ensuring they stayed loyal when it mattered most. He understood this better than anyone. While other criminals focused solely on rackets and territory, he built relationships with those who could protect his interests at the highest levels. Politicians, judges, law enforcement officers, and city officials, many of them were either on his payroll or in his debt. From the early days of his rise in organized crime, he recognized that money was the true key to power. Corruption was nothing new in American politics, and he made sure to take full advantage of it. Through a sophisticated system of bribery, campaign contributions, and personal favors, he cultivated a network of influential figures who helped shield him from legal trouble and allowed his business operations to thrive. One of his most effective strategies was ensuring that key figures in law enforcement looked the other way. Police captains and district attorneys were known to receive generous payouts, ensuring that raids on his operations were rare and, if they did happen, never resulted in serious consequences. Officers who were too honest or too ambitious in cracking down on organized crime often found themselves transferred, demoted, or pressured into silence by higher-ranking officials who had been bought and paid for. Judges, too, played a crucial role in his strategy. He understood that getting arrested wasn't the real problem. The real issue was what happened after an arrest. By securing influence over judges, he made sure that cases were dismissed, sentences were reduced, and trials were either delayed indefinitely or ended in acquittals. Witnesses suddenly forgot key details, evidence mysteriously disappeared, and prosecutors found themselves unwilling to push cases too hard. It was a well-oiled machine, one that allowed him to operate with near impunity, while others in the criminal world faced lengthy prison sentences. His reach extended beyond the courtroom and into the political arena. Elections, both local and national, became another playing field for his influence. He funneled money into political campaigns, backing candidates who would later return the favor with favorable policies, lucrative contracts, or simple indifference to his activities. Many politicians were aware of where their campaign funds came from, but as long as the money kept flowing and no direct connection could be traced, they saw little reason to resist. Beyond money, he offered something even more valuable: control over entire voting blocks. Through his connections in labor unions, immigrant communities, and key neighborhoods, he could sway elections by delivering thousands of votes to his preferred candidates. Union leaders under his influence ensured that their members voted a certain way, while local ward bosses made sure that neighborhoods aligned with his interests turned out at the polls in large numbers. In close elections, this kind of influence was often the deciding factor. His political reach was not limited to city government. State legislatures, governors, and even members of Congress found themselves indebted to him in one way or another. He had a keen understanding of how laws were made, how policies were shaped, and how to use loopholes to his advantage. In some cases, laws were even rewritten to favor his operations, making certain forms of gambling more difficult to prosecute or weakening enforcement efforts against illegal businesses. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his political influence was his ability to maintain a level of legitimacy in the public eye. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who flaunted their wealth and criminal status, he cultivated an image of respectability. He attended high-profile events, donated to charities, and moved in elite social circles where his connections only grew stronger. Business leaders, celebrities, and government officials treated him not as a gangster, but as a successful entrepreneur, one who had influence but never seemed to get his hands dirty. This level of political control was unprecedented in organized crime. While others relied on violence to secure their power, he relied on persuasion, strategy, and a deep understanding of human nature. He knew that everyone had a price, whether it was money, protection, political support, or simple favors, and he was always willing to pay it. But influence is a fragile thing, and even the most well-connected figures can only maintain their hold for so long. The 1950s brought new challenges, including greater scrutiny from federal investigators, public outrage over corruption, and the rise of ambitious lawmen who were determined to dismantle the criminal empires that had operated unchecked for decades. No man rises to the top of the underworld alone. In the world of organized crime, alliances could mean the difference between survival and destruction. He understood this from the very beginning, and throughout his career, he made strategic partnerships that elevated his status and secured his influence. But among all the relationships he built, None was more critical than his alliance with a man who would reshape the American Mafia, an ambitious and ruthless figure named Charles "Lucky" Luciano. The two first crossed paths in the early 1920s, when organized crime in New York was still dominated by the old-school traditions of Sicilian and Italian gangs. The Mafia of that time was rigid, divided by old-world customs, and plagued by infighting. Many of the older generation bosses clung to their strict codes of honor, resisting modernization and refusing to work with outsiders. This traditional approach limited their ability to expand and left them vulnerable to rivals. He and Luciano were part of a new generation of gangsters, men who saw organized crime not just as a collection of feuding families, but as a business. They believed in efficiency, profit, and removing obstacles that stood in the way of progress. While they respected the traditions of their ancestors, they saw the limitations in the old ways of doing things. Instead of endless street wars and bloody feuds, they envisioned a structured, corporate-style criminal empire that operated like a legitimate business. During Prohibition, both men quickly established themselves as key figures in the bootlegging trade. Luciano had the ambition and vision to expand operations beyond the ethnic barriers that traditionally divided the underworld, and his ally provided the intelligence and political connections needed to make it happen. Together, they worked to build an empire that was bigger than any single gang or ethnic group. They forged relationships with Jewish and Irish crime syndicates, breaking down the long-standing divisions that had kept the criminal world fragmented. Their partnership flourished, and by the late 1920s, they were part of a powerful network that controlled much of the illegal liquor business. But while money was pouring in, the criminal underworld was still dangerously unstable. The old bosses, men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, were locked in a violent struggle known as the Castellamarese War, a brutal conflict for control of the Mafia in New York. These older bosses refused to adapt to the modern criminal world, and their refusal to change made them targets. Luciano, with the backing of his trusted allies, saw an opportunity to reshape the Mafia. In 1931, he orchestrated the assassination of Masuria, then quickly moved against Maranzano, eliminating the last major obstacle to his vision. With the old guard removed, Luciano established the Commission, a governing body for the Mafia that structured organized crime into a national syndicate. This was a turning point in the history of the American underworld. No longer would the Mafia be ruled by a single, all-powerful boss. Instead, it would be run like a board of directors, with different crime families working together under a set of agreed-upon rules. This structure reduced the violence that had plagued organized crime and allowed the Mafia to focus on business rather than constant wars for dominance. In this new order, he played a crucial role. While Luciano was the face of the operation, he worked behind the scenes to strengthen their control. His skills in diplomacy, negotiation, and political maneuvering made him one of the most valuable members of the syndicate. He acted as a bridge between the underworld and the legitimate world, using his extensive network of politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials to ensure the Mafia's continued success. Their empire extended far beyond bootlegging. With Prohibition coming to an end, they knew they needed new revenue streams to maintain their power. Together, they expanded into gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and labor racketeering. They controlled casinos in major cities, infiltrated unions to manipulate industries, and even had influence over legitimate businesses. The Mafia had evolved from a loose collection of street gangs into a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise with national reach. The Luciano connection wasn't just about business, it was about vision. Together, they transformed the Mafia from a fractured, volatile organization into a disciplined, structured empire. They eliminated unnecessary conflicts, enforced rules that ensured stability, and introduced a level of sophistication that allowed organized crime to thrive for decades. But no empire lasts forever. Luciano's reign would eventually come under threat as law enforcement began cracking down on organized crime like never before. In 1936, he was convicted on charges of running a massive prostitution ring, charges that many believe were politically motivated to remove him from power. With Luciano sentenced to decades in prison, the balance of power within the Mafia began to shift. Yet, even as the leadership changed, the foundations they had built remained strong. The commission they established continued to govern organized crime, and the strategies they implemented ensured that the Mafia would survive even as its original architects faded from the scene. He, in particular, adapted better than most, using his political connections to maintain influence even as the government ramped up its war on organized crime. Their partnership had redefined the Mafia, setting the stage for its dominance throughout the mid-20th century. While others relied on brute force and reckless ambition, they had built something far greater, a criminal empire that operated with the precision of a Fortune 500 company, one that would endure long after they were gone. While Prohibition had been the foundation of his early wealth and power, he understood that alcohol smuggling would not sustain his empire forever. The repeal of Prohibition in 1933 meant that organized crime needed to shift focus to other lucrative enterprises. Many gangsters struggled to adapt, but he saw the opportunity before others did. He knew that gambling, an industry deeply rooted in American culture, could be controlled, expanded, and exploited for enormous profit. Unlike bootlegging, gambling could be manipulated in a way that ensured consistent revenue with minimal risk. It was the perfect business, and he set out to build an empire that would stretch across cities, states, and even into international markets. The expansion of gambling. During the 1930s and 1940s, he focused much of his attention on the gambling industry, investing heavily in casinos, betting parlors, and underground lotteries. His vision was different from that of other gangsters. He didn't want to simply run illegal gambling dens in dark basements or back rooms. He wanted to integrate gambling into mainstream society, making it an accepted and profitable business that could operate under the guise of legitimacy. His first step was taking control of illegal gambling operations in New York City. Through alliances with other crime figures, he ensured that numbers rackets, bookmaking operations, and high-stakes poker games remained under his control. The numbers racket, a form of illegal lottery, was particularly profitable, bringing in millions of dollars annually from working-class neighborhoods. These operations were so well organized that they rivaled state-run lotteries, with meticulous record-keeping, reliable payouts, and an enforcement network that ensured debts were collected without question. However, his ambitions extended far beyond the streets of New York. He recognized that the real money in gambling lay in casino operations, and there was one place in America where gambling had the potential to become a legitimate gold mine: Las Vegas. Las Vegas, and the rise of casino gambling. In the 1940s, Las Vegas was little more than a desert town, but he saw what it could become. With gambling legalized in Nevada, the city had the potential to be transformed into a gambling mecca, a place where organized crime could operate casinos without the constant threat of law enforcement crackdowns. While others were skeptical, he and his associates moved quickly, providing financial backing for some of the first major casino projects in the city. Through a series of frontmen and business partners, his network funneled millions of dollars into Las Vegas casinos, ensuring that organized crime had a foothold in the industry from the very beginning. These investments allowed them to control not only the casino operations, but also the labor unions, construction contracts, and even political figures who governed the city. Every dollar that flowed through the casinos was an opportunity for profit, whether through rigged games, money laundering, or loan sharking operations that preyed on gamblers who found themselves in over their heads. Unlike the violent, high-profile gangsters who drew attention to themselves, he took a different approach. He helped ensure that Las Vegas remained a place of entertainment and glamour, attracting tourists and celebrities who legitimized the casino industry. He knew that maintaining a respectable image was crucial to keeping law enforcement at bay, and he worked behind the scenes to ensure that the casinos ran smoothly while keeping his direct involvement hidden from public view. The Havana Connection and international gambling. Las Vegas was not the only gambling frontier he sought to control. By the late 1940s, he and his associates turned their attention to Cuba, a country with lax regulations and a government that was open to bribery. Havana, with its luxurious hotels, vibrant nightlife, and wealthy tourists, was the perfect place to expand the gambling empire beyond U.S. borders. Through partnerships with powerful Cuban officials, he helped establish a network of casinos and resorts that catered to wealthy Americans seeking an exotic gambling experience. The Havana operations became a critical part of organized crime's financial structure, allowing millions of dollars to be laundered through offshore accounts while generating enormous profits. Havana was, in many ways, an extension of Las Vegas, only with even fewer restrictions and even greater opportunities for corruption. The success of the Cuban gambling operations further solidified his reputation as one of the most intelligent and forward-thinking figures in organized crime. While others fought over street-level rackets, he was building a multinational financial empire. His influence stretched beyond the underworld and into the legitimate business world, where his operations became so sophisticated that they were nearly indistinguishable from lawful enterprises. Control over financial networks. Gambling was only part of his financial strategy. He understood that making money was one thing, but keeping it safe and out of the hands of law enforcement was another challenge entirely. To protect and grow his wealth, he helped develop one of the most intricate financial laundering systems in organized crime history. His operations relied on a network of front businesses, offshore bank accounts, and trusted financial experts who helped clean illegal money and reinvest it into legitimate enterprises. Money from gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and other illegal activities was funneled through restaurants, nightclubs, real estate ventures, and stock market investments, making it nearly impossible for authorities to trace the true source of his income. Additionally, he had deep ties to labor unions, particularly those that controlled the trucking, shipping, and construction industries. By manipulating union pension funds, he and his associates were able to access millions of dollars in capital, which they used to finance casino projects, loans to politicians, and bribes to law enforcement. These funds were often used to bankroll high-profile construction projects, further blurring the line between criminal enterprise and legitimate business. His control over financial networks was so effective that even federal investigators struggled to build cases against him. Unlike other gangsters who flaunted their wealth, he was careful. He lived modestly compared to his peers, avoided flashy displays of power, and never left behind obvious paper trails that could be used as evidence. This financial discipline allowed him to maintain his empire for decades while others were taken down by tax evasion charges and sloppy accounting. The long-term impact of his gambling empire. By the early 1950s, gambling had become one of the most profitable enterprises in organized crime, and he was one of the key architects of its success. His ability to integrate illegal gambling into mainstream society, control financial networks, and establish international connections ensured that organized crime remained a powerful economic force even after the end of Prohibition. However, success brought attention. Law enforcement agencies, once willing to turn a blind eye in exchange for bribes, began to shift their priorities. The government was starting to take organized crime more seriously, and high-profile Senate investigations into corruption and mafia influence were beginning to threaten the carefully built empire. For years, he had operated in the shadows, avoiding the reckless violence and flamboyant lifestyles that led to the downfall of many gangsters before him. He understood the value of discretion, preferring to wield power through influence rather than intimidation. While law enforcement knew of his activities, they had little evidence to pin him down. But by the late 1940s and early 1950s, the tide was shifting. The federal government was no longer willing to ignore the growing power of organized crime, and public sentiment was turning against the corruption that had allowed the underworld to flourish. The turning point came in 1950 when the U.S. Senate launched an unprecedented investigation into organized crime. Led by Senator Estes Kefauver, the hearings were designed to expose the extent of mafia influence over politics, business, labor unions, and law enforcement. The Kefauver Committee was determined to pull back the curtain on the world of organized crime, naming names and putting mob bosses in the national spotlight. For the first time, the American public was about to see the men who controlled their cities from behind the scenes. It was a moment of reckoning for the criminal underworld, and he was at the center of it all, testifying before the nation. Unlike many of his counterparts, who either refused to testify or denied any criminal involvement, he took a different approach. He understood that outright defiance would only increase scrutiny, and he also knew that invoking the Fifth Amendment, while a legally sound strategy, would make him appear guilty in the eyes of the public. Instead, he chose to testify, presenting himself as a legitimate businessman with no ties to illegal activities. When he appeared before the Kefauver Committee, he did not look like the stereotypical gangster. There were no flashy suits, no intimidating presence, no air of menace. He was calm, well-dressed, and soft-spoken, a stark contrast to the brutal image of organized crime that the public had come to expect. His demeanor was not that of a criminal mastermind, but of a respectable businessman caught in the middle of political hysteria. He answered questions in a measured, composed manner, carefully avoiding self-incrimination. When pressed about his financial dealings, he claimed ignorance. When asked about his connections to known criminals, he downplayed them as mere acquaintances. His strategy was simple: give them nothing while appearing cooperative. However, despite his careful approach, the hearings were a disaster for organized crime. The Kefauver Committee, broadcasting live to millions of Americans, exposed the sheer depth of mafia control over key industries and public officials. Testimonies from informants, police officers, and former associates painted a damning picture of widespread corruption, extortion, and violence. Even though he personally avoided making any major missteps during his testimony, the hearing solidified his public image as one of the most powerful crime figures in the country. The fallout: changing public perception. Before the Kefauver hearings, organized crime was something that most Americans only read about in newspapers. It was a world that existed in the shadows, whispered about, but never fully understood. The hearings changed that. For the first time, the American people saw, in real time, the men who controlled their cities, rigged their elections, and dictated the flow of money and power. His appearance before the committee marked a turning point. While he had spent decades crafting an image of legitimacy, the hearings shattered that illusion. He could no longer operate under the radar. His name was now known to the public, law enforcement agencies, and politicians alike. The government, under increasing pressure to crack down on organized crime, began aggressively targeting him and his associates. Law enforcement agencies that had once been compromised by bribery and political influence were now under national scrutiny. The FBI, which had previously focused on communist threats rather than organized crime, started shifting its attention toward dismantling the Mafia's financial networks. The days of unchecked power were coming to an end, and even someone as careful and calculated as he could not escape the growing pressure. Legal troubles and increased surveillance. Following the hearings, federal and state authorities began to intensify their efforts to bring him down. Tax investigators scrutinized his financial records, looking for inconsistencies that could lead to charges of tax evasion, the same method that had been used to convict Al Capone years earlier. Additionally, his gambling operations, once protected by political connections, were now under constant investigation. The safe channels he had relied on for years were becoming less reliable. Police raids on casinos, wiretaps on associates, and undercover operations all aimed to dismantle the empire he had spent decades building. The hearings also emboldened younger law enforcement officials who saw taking down organized crime as a career-making opportunity. While he had spent years cultivating relationships with politicians and law enforcement leaders, many of his old allies were either retiring, being forced out of office, or distancing themselves to avoid scandal. The protective barriers he had built around himself were slowly crumbling. Despite all this, he remained composed. He had survived Prohibition, the Great Depression, internal mafia conflicts, and shifting political landscapes. He was a master of adaptation, and even as the government closed in, he believed he could weather the storm. The shift in organized crime. The Kefauver hearings didn't just affect him personally, they changed the entire structure of organized crime. The old model of bribing officials and operating in the open was no longer sustainable. In response to the increased scrutiny, many crime families began moving their operations deeper underground, using more sophisticated methods to avoid detection. The hearings also accelerated the decline of direct mafia involvement in high-profile industries. Where once organized crime had openly controlled gambling, labor unions, and political figures, the pressure from federal investigations forced many operations to become more covert. New strategies were developed, using front companies, offshore accounts, and more complex money laundering tactics to keep law enforcement at bay. For him, this shift presented both a challenge and an opportunity. The old ways were dying, but he had always been skilled at navigating change. If he could once again adapt, he might yet find a way to maintain his influence in a world where the government was determined to dismantle everything he had built. Power in the underworld was one thing, but real control, true, lasting influence, came from having a hand in the legitimate world as well. He understood this better than almost any of his contemporaries. While other mobsters relied on violence and intimidation to maintain their empires, he built a different kind of power structure, one based on relationships, loyalty, and corruption at the highest levels of government. From the earliest days of his career, he realized that success in organized crime wasn't just about running illegal enterprises, it was about protection. The more powerful his allies were in politics, law enforcement, and business, the safer he was. The Mafia had always bribed local cops and city officials to look the other way, but he took it to another level. His influence extended beyond police departments and city halls. He had connections that reached into the highest offices of government, stretching from state capitals all the way to Washington, D.C. The art of political manipulation. Unlike many of his peers, he had a unique ability to blend into respectable society. He didn't dress like a thug or act like a street boss. He was polished, articulate, and well-mannered, qualities that allowed him to move freely in elite circles. He cultivated relationships with politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials, often appearing as nothing more than a successful businessman with a keen interest in civic affairs. His strategy was not just to bribe officials, but to make himself indispensable to them. He provided financial backing to political campaigns, ensuring that candidates who came into power owed him favors. He arranged quiet meetings between businessmen and politicians, using his network to broker deals that benefited all parties involved. He positioned himself as a fixer, someone who could make problems disappear with a phone call. For public officials who needed funding for their campaigns, he was a generous benefactor. For those facing political threats, he had the means to neutralize opponents, either through financial pressure, blackmail, or quiet persuasion. He didn't just buy influence. He built relationships that ensured long-term loyalty, control over law enforcement, and the courts. One of his greatest achievements was securing protection from law enforcement. While many crime figures lived in constant fear of raids, indictments, and arrests, he operated with a level of confidence that came from knowing he had allies in key positions. Many police officers, district attorneys, and even judges were on his payroll, ensuring that investigations into his activities never gained momentum. If a case against him or his associates did make it to court, witnesses had a habit of recanting their statements, evidence would mysteriously disappear, and juries would be influenced before a verdict was reached. His control over the judicial system was so extensive that for years, prosecutors struggled to build a solid case against him. He was careful never to personally order violence or handle illegal transactions himself, making it nearly impossible to tie him directly to criminal activity. He understood the legal system better than most, using its complexities to his advantage. Ties to union leadership. Another key source of his power was his control over labor unions. He understood that unions were more than just organizations for workers. They were financial powerhouses with access to pension funds, political leverage, and the ability to shut down entire industries with strikes. By securing influence over union leaders, he gained access to enormous sums of money, which he used to fund both legitimate and illegal enterprises. Through his control of unions, he could dictate terms to major industries, influencing construction contracts, shipping routes, and even government projects. Business owners who refused to cooperate would find their workers going on strike or their shipments being mysteriously delayed. Those who played by his rules, however, found smooth operations and lucrative deals. His control over unions also gave him leverage in politics. Many politicians relied on union endorsements to win elections, and those endorsements often came with an unspoken understanding, protect his interests, and he would ensure the full support of the unions under his influence. The silent hand in city and state politics. Though he never held an official position, his reach into city and state politics was undeniable. Mayors, governors, and even U.S. senators had ties to him, whether directly or through intermediaries. He was known to have played a role in key elections, using his financial resources and connections to sway outcomes in his favor. One of his greatest strengths was his ability to keep politicians indebted to him without them realizing the full extent of his control. He rarely made direct threats or demands. Instead, he operated subtly, ensuring that those in power knew that he was a valuable ally and that turning against him could have consequences. If a politician stepped out of line or refused to cooperate, he had multiple ways of handling the situation. Sometimes, it was as simple as cutting off campaign funding. Other times, he would use his media connections to generate scandals that could ruin careers. In extreme cases, threats or acts of intimidation would serve as reminders of where true power resided. A reputation that reached Washington. His influence wasn't limited to city and state politics. It extended all the way to the nation's capital. He had contacts within the highest levels of government, and while he never openly flaunted his connections, those in the know understood just how deeply embedded he was in the political machine. During World War II, for example, when the U.S. government needed assistance securing the docks from potential sabotage, it was his connections within the longshoremen's unions that helped ensure the safety of critical shipping operations. This cooperation with the government only reinforced his image as someone who could not only control crime but also be useful to the state when necessary. Even as law enforcement agencies like the FBI began ramping up efforts to dismantle organized crime, he remained largely untouchable for years. His political connections provided a level of security that few others in the underworld could match. The growing threat of exposure. But power built on corruption is never truly secure. As public scrutiny on organized crime intensified, his once reliable political allies began distancing themselves. The same politicians who once benefited from his financial backing and strategic influence were now under pressure to prove they were not connected to the Mafia. The Kefauver hearings had already exposed the deep ties between organized crime and the political system, and as government agencies became more aggressive in their pursuit of the Mafia, his protective network began to weaken. Prosecutors who had once turned a blind eye were now eager to make a name for themselves by taking him down. While he had spent decades cultivating relationships that shielded him from legal consequences, he was now facing a reality in which those relationships could no longer protect him indefinitely. The tide was turning, and even the most well-connected man in organized crime could not escape the growing momentum of law enforcement's crackdown. No empire, no matter how carefully built, is immune to internal threats. He was a master of diplomacy and influence, but even he could not completely escape the rivalries and power struggles that define the world of organized crime. The Mafia was not a single, unified entity. It was a collection of powerful crime families, each with their own interests, ambitions, and codes of loyalty. While he worked tirelessly to maintain stability and avoid unnecessary bloodshed, there were always those who resented his influence, challenged his authority, or sought to take what he had built. Tensions within the Mafia structure. From the very beginning, organized crime in America was structured around families, each controlling different territories and industries. While alliances were often formed for mutual benefit, the Mafia was not without its internal rivalries. Even within a single crime family, disagreements over leadership, money, and business strategies could lead to deadly conflicts. His leadership style was different from that of many of his contemporaries. Where others used violence to assert dominance, he preferred to rule through diplomacy, negotiation, and strategic alliances. He believed that unnecessary killings brought too much attention from law enforcement and disrupted the flow of money. He saw the Mafia as a business, and like any business, internal stability was key to long-term success. However, not everyone in the underworld shared his vision. There were those who believed that his approach was too soft, that his emphasis on political influence and financial manipulation was a betrayal of the traditional Mafia code of power through fear. As his influence grew, so did the number of enemies who sought to undermine him. Clashes with the old guard. One of his biggest challenges came from within his own ranks, older, more traditional Mafia figures who viewed him with suspicion. Many of these men had built their careers in the brutal days of Prohibition, when gang wars were common, and power was determined by who was willing to spill the most blood. They saw him as a businessman rather than a true gangster, someone who had risen to power through political connections rather than brute force. There were whispers among the old guard that he was too comfortable with law enforcement and politicians, that his efforts to keep the Mafia out of the newspapers and the courtroom had made the organization weak. They feared that his refusal to engage in open warfare when necessary would eventually lead to their downfall. These tensions came to a head in several key moments throughout his career, as rival factions within the Mafia debated whether his leadership style was the right path for the future of organized crime. He had to navigate these conflicts carefully, using his intelligence and strategic thinking to maintain his position while avoiding outright war. Challenges from younger, more aggressive mobsters. While he faced opposition from the older generation of mobsters, he also found himself at odds with the younger generation, men who had grown up in a different era, with different ideas about how organized crime should be run. These younger gangsters, many of whom had come of age during the violent 1930s and 1940s, saw him as outdated, a relic of a time when Mafia leaders avoided attention rather than embracing their own notoriety. Unlike him, these younger mobsters were not afraid of public recognition. They flaunted their wealth, engaged in high-profile crimes, and made little effort to avoid law enforcement scrutiny. They saw the Mafia not as a secretive institution but as an open power structure, one that could thrive through force and fear rather than quiet influence. He recognized the danger that this new wave of gangsters posed, not just to his own position but to the entire structure of organized crime. He understood that the more reckless the Mafia became, the more aggressively the government would move against it. He tried to instill a sense of discipline and caution in the younger generation, but not all of them were willing to listen. The power struggle over leadership. Perhaps the greatest internal challenge to his power came in the form of leadership disputes within the Mafia. As powerful as he was not the unquestioned ruler of organized crime. He was part of a larger structure that required consensus among the most powerful crime families. Throughout his reign, there were moments when his authority was directly challenged. Rival bosses, eager to expand their influence, saw opportunities to weaken his position. Some questioned his leadership, arguing that he was too focused on political connections and not ruthless enough to lead. Others saw his success as a threat, fearing that his influence over politicians and law enforcement gave him too much power. In some cases, these disputes led to negotiations and uneasy truces. In others, they led to outright conflict, as rival factions attempted to assert their dominance. While he was able to avoid the kind of bloody wars that had plagued the Mafia in the past, he was constantly engaged in a delicate balancing act, ensuring that his rivals never gained enough support to overthrow him. The role of the Commission. One of his most significant contributions to organized crime was his role in shaping and maintaining the Mafia's governing body, the Commission. Established as a way to prevent unnecessary conflicts and regulate Mafia operations, the Commission was meant to provide stability and order. He played a key role in using the Commission to mediate disputes and prevent all-out warfare between families. He believed that open violence was bad for business, and that the Mafia's power was best preserved through unity rather than division. However, not all Mafia leaders agreed with his vision. There were those who resented the Commission's authority, seeing it as a bureaucratic obstacle rather than a necessary governing body. At times, the very structure he had helped create threatened to turn against him. If enough powerful bosses decided that he was no longer fit to lead, he could be voted out, sidelined, or worse. He had to constantly work to maintain his influence within the Commission, ensuring that he had enough allies to keep his position secure. The ever-present threat of betrayal. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of internal Mafia conflicts was the ever-present threat of betrayal. In a world built on secrecy and loyalty, a single defection could bring everything crashing down. As law enforcement pressure increased, more and more gangsters began turning informant, providing testimony that could dismantle entire crime families. He knew that any rival, any dissatisfied associate, could potentially become a government witness. Even those he had trusted for years were not immune to the temptation of avoiding prison in exchange for cooperation with authorities. He worked tirelessly to maintain loyalty within his ranks, ensuring that those closest to him remained loyal through financial incentives, strategic marriages, and carefully cultivated relationships. But no matter how careful he was, betrayal was always a possibility. The shifting balance of power. As the 1950s progressed, the internal struggles within the Mafia became more pronounced. The old ways were fading, and new threats were emerging. Law enforcement was becoming more aggressive, younger gangsters were becoming more reckless, and the power structure of organized crime was shifting. For decades, he had built an empire, carefully weaving a network of influence that extended from the backrooms of smoky speakeasies to the highest offices in government. He had survived gang wars, law enforcement crackdowns, and internal power struggles within the Mafia. He had outmaneuvered rivals, maintained his position through diplomacy rather than brute force, and shaped the very structure of organized crime in America. But no man, no matter how powerful or strategic, can outrun time. The forces that had once protected him were beginning to weaken, and the legal system that he had long avoided was finally closing in. The shift in law enforcement tactics. For years, law enforcement had struggled to bring him down. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he had been careful to distance himself from direct criminal activity. He did not engage in the flashy, violent behavior that made so many other gangsters easy targets for prosecution. He was a businessman in every sense of the word, handling operations through intermediaries, never leaving a clear trail for investigators to follow. But by the 1950s, the strategies used by the government to combat organized crime were changing. The days of bribing a few cops or paying off a judge to dismiss a case were coming to an end. The Kefauver hearings had exposed the true extent of the Mafia's control over industries, labor unions, and even politics, leading to increased public pressure to dismantle the organization. Federal agencies, particularly the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, had been reluctant to acknowledge the existence of a nationwide criminal syndicate for years. However, as organized crime became a growing public concern, Hoover and his agents could no longer ignore it. With new investigative techniques, including wiretaps and financial audits, law enforcement was beginning to uncover the hidden layers of the Mafia's operations. He had spent a lifetime navigating the legal system, but the rules of the game were changing. What had once been a world governed by backdoor deals and silent agreements was now under the microscope of the federal government. Prosecutors were no longer content with minor arrests. They wanted to bring down the heads of the families. The tax evasion case, a strategy that had worked before. With little direct evidence linking him to violent crimes or illegal business dealings, law enforcement had to find another way to take him down. They turned to a strategy that had been used successfully against Al Capone decades earlier: tax evasion. While he had been careful in many aspects of his business, his financial dealings had always been complex. He had amassed enormous wealth through gambling, racketeering, and other illicit enterprises, but much of that money had been laundered through legitimate businesses, investments, and political contributions. However, no matter how careful he was, the sheer scale of his operations made it nearly impossible to hide everything. Federal investigators combed through his financial records, looking for inconsistencies and undeclared income. Eventually, they found enough discrepancies to bring charges against him. It was not the kind of dramatic arrest that involved gunfights or police raids. It was a quiet but devastating legal maneuver. The government would not get him on murder or extortion, but they would put him behind bars for unpaid taxes. Trial and conviction. The fall of a titan. The trial was a media sensation. He was no ordinary gangster. He was one of the most powerful men in organized crime, a figure who had once been untouchable. Prosecutors painted him as a criminal mastermind who had manipulated the system for decades, avoiding justice while controlling vast illegal enterprises. Despite his previous success in avoiding legal trouble, the evidence against him in the tax case was too strong. The government had learned from past mistakes. This time, they had built a solid case that left little room for escape. His usual tactics, political connections, bribed officials, and legal loopholes, could not save him. When the verdict was read, it was a defining moment. He had spent his entire career building a reputation as a man above the law, someone who operated beyond the reach of prosecutors and law enforcement. But now, he was facing a prison sentence, stripped of the very power that had made him one of the most influential figures in the underworld. Prison, a different kind of battle. Prison was an entirely different world, one where his influence meant little. On the outside, he had controlled politicians, police, and businesses. Inside, he was just another inmate, subject to the same rules as everyone else. For a man who had built his life on quiet control and careful maneuvering, the loss of freedom was a crushing blow. He was no longer the man pulling the strings behind the scenes. He was at the mercy of a system he had spent decades outsmarting. His time behind bars was not marked by violence or rebellion. He was not the type to cause trouble in prison. Instead, he remained composed, adapting to his new reality just as he had adapted to so many other changes in his life. But the world outside was moving on without him. The Mafia's changing landscape. While he was in prison, the world of organized crime was shifting. The careful, diplomatic style of leadership he had championed was fading, replaced by a new generation of gangsters who had little interest in maintaining political alliances or avoiding public attention. Younger, more aggressive figures were rising to power, men who saw violence as a necessary tool rather than a last resort. They were less concerned with discretion and more willing to engage in high-profile crimes that drew media scrutiny. The delicate balance he had maintained between the mafia and law enforcement was breaking down. New laws were being passed, giving prosecutors and federal agents more tools to dismantle organized crime. The FBI's use of surveillance and informants was increasing, making it harder for crime families to operate in secrecy. The days of quiet control were giving way to a more chaotic and dangerous era. For years, he had been the stabilizing force within the mafia, the man who ensured that business ran smoothly without unnecessary bloodshed. But as he sat in prison, he knew that the structure he had helped build was beginning to crumble. The alliances he had forged were no longer holding, and the careful strategies he had relied on were being abandoned. Struggles for power, a leader in exile. Even from behind bars, he remained a figure of influence. His words still carried weight, and many within the mafia remained loyal to him. But without his direct involvement, power struggles erupted. Some saw his imprisonment as an opportunity to take control, while others questioned whether he could still lead from a prison cell. There were whispers that he was no longer fit to run things, that the mafia needed a leader who was free and able to act without restrictions. Rival factions debated who should take his place, leading to increased tensions within the organization. He had spent years ensuring that the mafia operated like a business, avoiding the reckless violence that had destroyed so many before him. But now, with his influence weakened, the organization was at risk of returning to the kind of infighting that had once threatened its survival. Even as the power he had spent decades building began to slip away, his influence on organized crime remained undeniable. He had fundamentally reshaped the mafia, transforming it from a collection of violent street gangs into a highly sophisticated, business-oriented empire. His leadership had steered the organization through some of the most tumultuous times in its history, allowing it to thrive in an era when law enforcement and government agencies were intensifying their efforts to dismantle the underworld. But as the years passed, the world of crime was evolving. The old ways were being challenged, and the structure he had so carefully crafted was being tested by new pressures, from both within and outside the mafia. The question was not just what would happen to him personally, but what his legacy would mean for the future of organized crime. A different kind of leadership. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he had never sought power through brute force. He understood that true control was not about who could pull the trigger fastest, but about who could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the competition. His rise to power had been built on intelligence, strategy, and a deep understanding of human nature. He saw the mafia as an institution that could operate like a corporation, with defined leadership structures, clear business objectives, and a focus on long-term stability rather than short-term gains. He believed that keeping violence to a minimum was not just about avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. It was a calculated move to keep law enforcement and political scrutiny at bay. This vision had allowed the mafia to flourish during his reign. While other crime figures were making headlines for shootouts and assassinations, he was securing political connections, controlling unions, and ensuring that the organization's financial interests remained protected. He turned the Mafia into something more than just a criminal syndicate. It became an economic powerhouse, influencing industries ranging from construction to gambling. The impact on law enforcement strategy. His ability to blend the worlds of crime and politics had made him one of the most difficult figures for law enforcement to take down. Unlike the brash, reckless gangsters of earlier decades, he operated with precision, making it nearly impossible to tie him directly to illegal activities. But his success also forced the government to rethink its approach to fighting organized crime. The traditional methods, arresting low-level criminals and raiding illegal gambling dens, were no longer enough. Law enforcement agencies had to adapt, developing more sophisticated techniques to combat the kind of organization he had built. In many ways, the modern war on organized crime was shaped by the challenge of bringing him down. His ability to operate in the shadows, to exert influence without directly engaging in criminal acts, forced agencies like the FBI to shift their focus toward financial investigations, wiretaps, and long-term surveillance operations. This shift would ultimately contribute to the downfall of many mafia figures in the decades that followed. The techniques developed to track his activities became standard tools in law enforcement's arsenal, making it increasingly difficult for future crime bosses to operate with the same level of security that he had enjoyed for so long. The end of an era. By the time his influence began to wane, it was clear that the Mafia was entering a new phase. The carefully managed relationships with politicians and law enforcement that had allowed the organization to thrive were breaking down. Public pressure to crack down on organized crime was increasing, and the government was passing new laws designed to dismantle the Mafia's power structure. Younger, more reckless gangsters were coming into power, men who had not been shaped by the careful diplomacy and strategic patience that had defined his leadership. They were more willing to engage in open violence, more interested in personal wealth and notoriety than in maintaining the stability of the organization. This shift in leadership would have profound consequences for the Mafia. The old code of silence, which had once been an unbreakable rule, was beginning to erode. More and more mobsters were turning informant, cutting deals with prosecutors to avoid long prison sentences. The organization that had once operated with near impenetrable secrecy was now facing a wave of betrayals from within, a legacy that could not be erased. Despite the changing landscape, his legacy endured. His approach to leadership, favoring diplomacy over violence, influence over intimidation, remained a model for those who understood the importance of long-term survival in the underworld. Even after he was gone, his impact could still be seen in the way organized crime adapted to new challenges. His emphasis on legitimate business investments, political alliances, and financial control became a blueprint for the future of the Mafia. While some crime families would drift back into the kind of reckless violence that led to their downfall, others would follow the path he had laid out, using legal enterprises to shield their illegal activities. His name continued to be spoken with respect, even among those who had once sought to challenge him. To many within the Mafia, he represented the last of a dying breed, a leader who had understood the delicate balance required to keep the organization strong. Outside of the underworld, his story became the subject of fascination. He was studied by law enforcement agencies, historians, and even business leaders who recognized the brilliance of his tactics. His ability to navigate power structures, to manipulate political systems, and to maintain control without resorting to unnecessary violence made him one of the most studied figures in the history of organized crime. The changing face of crime. As the decades passed, organized crime continued to evolve. The traditional mafia structure that he had helped refine faced new challenges from emerging criminal enterprises. Drug cartels, cybercrime networks, and global criminal organizations began to replace the old guard, using new technologies and tactics to operate on an even larger scale. But even as the nature of crime changed, many of the principles he had championed remained relevant. The importance of political influence, financial control, and strategic decision-making continued to be key factors in the success of any criminal organization. The world he had once dominated no longer existed in the same form, but his methods lived on. His story was a reminder that true power is not always about brute force. It is about understanding people, navigating complex systems, and knowing when to act and when to remain in the shadows. As the years passed and the world of organized crime transformed, his legacy remained firmly etched in history. He had been more than just another mafia boss. He had been a visionary, a man who redefined what it meant to wield power in the criminal underworld. Unlike so many others who had risen and fallen in a storm of violence, he had built something far more lasting, a system, a philosophy, a method of leadership that would influence generations to come. His ability to navigate the murky waters of crime and politics had made him one of the most respected figures in the mafia's history. While others sought power through bloodshed, he had secured it through strategy. He understood that true control was not about making enemies fear you, it was about making them need you. Through careful alliances, calculated risks, and an unwavering focus on the bigger picture, he had shaped organized crime into something far more complex and enduring than the street-level gangs of the past. Yet, for all his intelligence and foresight, even he could not stop the inevitable. Time, changing law enforcement tactics, and internal power struggles eventually took their toll. The organization he had worked so hard to stabilize faced new pressures, and the reckless ambitions of the next generation of criminals threatened to undo much of what he had built. In the end, his downfall was not the result of a rival's bullet or a dramatic betrayal. It was the slow, relentless march of progress. Governments adapted, laws changed, and the old ways of doing business became unsustainable. The quiet diplomacy he had championed gave way to a new era of crime, one marked by public spectacle and increasingly severe crackdowns by law enforcement. Even after his influence faded, his name carried weight. Those who understood the mafia's history looked back at his time as an era of intelligence and order, a stark contrast to the chaos that followed. To law enforcement, he was a symbol of the challenge they had faced in taking down a man who had always been 2 steps ahead. To historians, he was a study in power, influence, and the delicate balance between crime and politics. But for the world he had ruled, he remained something more. He was a reminder of what the mafia had once been at its peak, an empire built not just on violence, but on control, discipline, and a deep understanding of human nature. His time at the top had proven that crime, when managed like a business, could reach levels of influence that few could imagine. And so, his story did not end with a dramatic shootout or a public betrayal. It ended with the quiet realization that his era had passed. The world had changed, and the mafia was changing with it. But the principles he had lived by, the power of diplomacy, the necessity of influence, the art of ruling from the shadows, would never truly disappear. His name would live on, not just as a gangster, but as a strategist, a mastermind, and a figure who had left an indelible mark on the history of organized crime. And while the organization he once controlled would continue to evolve, it would always bear the imprint of the man who had once ruled it with intelligence, restraint, and an unmatched understanding of power.